While Washington was busy arguing with itself over chip export rules, China quietly built a new world order for artificial intelligence. And they did it in 4 days, in Shanghai, in front of hundreds of thousands of people. This is the World Artificial Intelligence Conference, WAIC 2026. And if you haven't heard about it, that's exactly the problem. Because what happened at this event should genuinely worry anyone paying attention to the AI race. This wasn't just another tech expo, this was China laying out, in plain sight, a strategy that could reshape who controls the future of artificial intelligence, and the US barely made a dent in the conversation. Let's get into why this summit should have America paying very close attention. So every summer, Shanghai hosts this AI expo called WAIC. It's been running for 9 years, but this year was different. This wasn't just a trade show, it was a coming out party for China's entire AI strategy, personally backed by Xi Jinping, who delivered the keynote himself for the first time in the event's history. When the head of state shows up to a tech conference and gives the opening speech, that's not a scheduling coincidence. That's a signal. Beijing wanted the entire world watching this one, and the scale backs that up. Over 100,000 square meters of exhibition space, the largest footprint in the event's history. More than 1,100 exhibitors, hundreds of thousands of visitors packed into the venue across 4 days, and more than 300 AI products making their global debut, all at once under one roof. That's not a conference, that's a coordinated show of force. But the headline moment, the thing that should actually make you sit up, happened on day one. On July 17th, Xi Jinping stood up and announced the creation of something called the World AI Cooperation Organization, or WAICO. Think of it as China's answer to the AI governance conversations that have mostly been dominated by Washington and Brussels. 29 countries signed on as founding members, right there in Shanghai. Russia, Brazil, Pakistan, Indonesia, Cuba, Venezuela, plus a batch of African and Asian nations. Headquarters, Shanghai. Now here's the detail that should really catch your attention. Not a single major Western democracy signed on. Not one G7 country is in that room. China didn't try to negotiate its way into the existing Western-led AI governance conversation. It built an entirely separate one, and it built it by going straight to the global south instead of asking permission from Washington first. Xi framed it in pretty sweeping terms, calling AI not a solo performance by one country, but a symphony of international cooperation. Nice line for a headline, but strip away the poetry and here's what you're actually left with. China just stood up a parallel institution for global AI rules, with real member states, a real headquarters, and a 5-year roadmap already attached to it. Reading through the actual transcript of the speech, Xi went out of his way to frame AI governance in almost civilizational terms, tracing the technology all the way back 70 years to the original Dartmouth workshop where the term artificial intelligence was first coined, and arguing that after 7 decades, humanity finally has a responsibility to guide the technology toward, in his words, the positive, for good, and for humanity. He talked about the need for oversight that's precise and effective, and about constantly refining measures to prevent what he called loss of control. It's worth noting that language because it's a deliberate contrast with how a lot of Western AI safety discourse gets framed. Instead of talking primarily about existential risk from superintelligence, Xi's framing leaned heavily into equity, access, and shared prosperity, positioning China as the country actually listening to what developing nations have been asking for, while painting Western AI governance efforts as exclusive, slow, and mostly designed to protect the existing leader's advantage rather than to lift anyone else up. And that roadmap is the part that should worry Washington most. Beijing pledged 5,000 AI training slots for developing nations over the next 5 years. Access to shared infrastructure. A seat at the table for countries that have mostly been locked out of the AI conversation entirely because they don't have the compute, the capital, or the talent pipelines to build a domestic AI industry on their own. Think about who that pitch is actually aimed at. Dozens of countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America are watching 2 very different offers right now. The American approach has largely been export controls and chip restrictions, essentially a strategy of denial, keep the advanced technology out of certain hands. China's approach is the opposite. Come train with us. Come build with us. Plug into our ecosystem, and we'll help you stand up your own AI capacity. If you're a mid-sized country trying to figure out where you even fit in this race, one of those pitches is a lot easier to say yes to than the other. This is the long game, and it's exactly why the America should be terrified framing isn't just clickbait. It's not about winning next quarter's headlines, it's about who ends up writing the rulebook that the majority of the world actually uses. 29 countries just signed on to China's version of that rulebook in a single afternoon. The US didn't even have a competing offer on the table. Before we move off WAICO, there's one more layer worth unpacking because it explains why this alliance is so much more than a photo op. China didn't just invite these 29 countries to a signing ceremony and call it a day. She laid out a whole package alongside the announcement, including something called the AI Capacity Building Action Plan, and a broader push he's calling the AI Plus International Cooperation Initiative. China also worked to get a resolution through the UN General Assembly on enhancing international cooperation on AI capacity building, and got it adopted by consensus, meaning no country in the room objected. That's a meaningful diplomatic achievement on its own, getting the entire UN to sign off on language that positions China as a responsible, cooperative leader on AI governance. At a moment when a lot of Western commentary still frames China's AI ambitions as purely a security threat. So this isn't just an alliance of convenience, it's a full diplomatic architecture built layer by layer with the UN resolution as the top-level cover, WAICO as the operational body, and the training programs as the actual delivery mechanism that gets real engineers in real countries real skills. That's a much harder thing to compete with than a single press release because it's designed to keep paying dividends for years, regardless of which political administration happens to be in charge in Washington at any given moment. Now let's talk hardware, because this is where the terror factor really kicks in. At the same event, Huawei unveiled something called the Atlas 950 supercomputer. This system packs 8,192 chips into a single unit. Let that number sink in. This is happening at the exact same time the US has spent years trying to choke off China's access to advanced semiconductors through export controls. And yet here's Huawei on a stage in Shanghai, showing off a supercomputer built almost entirely on domestic silicon in front of the world's press. To be clear, this doesn't mean China has fully solved its chip problem. It hasn't. Huawei's individual chips still generally lag behind NVIDIA's best in raw performance per unit. But what China has figured out is scale. If you can't match the West chip for chip, you go wide instead of narrow. You stack thousands of slightly weaker chips together and engineer your way to comparable system-level performance. It's a brute force workaround, but it's clearly working well enough that Huawei felt confident putting it front and center at the biggest AI show of the year in front of a global audience that includes the very governments trying to restrict its access to cutting-edge fabrication technology. To put that 8,192 chip number in perspective, we're talking about a single system, with roughly the chip count of what would have been considered a top-tier national supercomputing cluster just a few years ago, except now it's being positioned as a commercial AI training platform that Huawei is actively marketing to Chinese enterprises and government clients. It's also a very deliberate answer to years of Western commentary suggesting China simply couldn't compete at the high end of AI compute without access to the most advanced Taiwanese and American fabrication technology. Huawei's message with the Atlas 950 was essentially, watch us build a competitive system anyway, using what we have. That's the real signal here, and it's the part that should genuinely concern American policymakers. Export controls were supposed to slow China down, and to some extent they did. Beijing is still behind on the most advanced process nodes. But those same restrictions also forced a level of domestic innovation and industrial mobilization that might end up making China's semiconductor base more self-sufficient in the long run, not less. You can't sanction a country into permanent technological dependence if that country has the industrial base, the state backing, and the sheer will to build its own supply chain instead. China is proving in real time that it has all three. There's also a software side to this that deserves its own moment, because it ties directly back to the alliance we just talked about. At WAIC, Chinese officials and executives leaned hard into the idea that China is now the world's leading advocate for open source AI. Some foreign commentators have described China's open source models as a potential trap, the idea being that once a country builds its AI stack on top of a Chinese open source model, it becomes quietly dependent on China's ecosystem going forward. Chinese officials publicly dismissed that framing at the conference as ideological bias, but honestly, whether you buy their denial or not, the strategic logic behind the concern is pretty straightforward. If you're a developing country and someone hands you a powerful, free, open-source AI model along with training support to actually use it, you take the deal, and every country that takes that deal becomes another thread connecting the global AI ecosystem back to Beijing instead of Washington. This is also where China's manufacturing dominance quietly becomes an AI advantage. Executives at WAIC argued openly that China's decades of manufacturing strength, the same strength that gave the world cheap solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles, is becoming a global asset for AI too, especially in the embodied AI and robotics space, where you actually need factories, not just server farms, to compete. The pitch is basically this: the West may have the best labs, but China has the best factories. And in the age of humanoid robots and physical AI, factories increasingly matter just as much as labs do. Now let's talk about the part of WAIC that actually went viral, the robots, because this is where the strategy becomes visible, not just theoretical. If you've seen any clips floating around from this event, it was probably the humanoid robots. China brought an army of them to Shanghai, robots directing pedestrian traffic outside the venue, robots performing choreographed dance routines for crowds, robots showing off dexterity with artificial hands, doing tasks that used to be humanoid robotics' biggest weakness: fine motor control, grip strength, balance. This isn't just for show either. China's humanoid robot industry is exploding right now at a pace that's honestly difficult to overstate. Government officials are projecting the country will produce more than 100,000 humanoid robots this year alone. That's not a lab experiment anymore, that's an actual manufacturing industry standing up in real time with real factories, real supply chains, and real output numbers. And the money is following just as fast. Unitree, one of China's biggest humanoid robot makers, just got fast-tracked for an IPO listing in Shanghai. LimX Dynamics, a startup that's only about 4 years old, just raised $200 million in a single pre-IPO funding round. Hong Kong alone is currently processing IPO applications from more than 500 companies across the robotics and broader tech sector. This is a full-blown gold rush, the kind of capital stampede you usually only see once or twice in a generation, and it's happening almost entirely inside China's borders right now. Shanghai itself has set a target of deploying 100,000 humanoid robots citywide by 2030, and officials are already calling 2026 the inaugural year of embodied AI deployment. That's not a vague long-term ambition. That's a city government treating humanoid robots as core urban infrastructure on the same level as public transit or power grids, and putting a hard number and a hard date on it. And it's not just Unitree and LimX Dynamics driving this. AgiBot, another major player in the space, is reportedly ramping production fast, with industry reporting suggesting the company has already crossed the 10,000 unit mark in cumulative production. Analysts covering the sector, including researchers at Deutsche Bank, have published notes this month arguing the global humanoid robot market is accelerating faster than expected, with China sitting squarely at the center of that acceleration rather than on the periphery of it. When international investment banks start publishing dedicated research notes on a country's robotics sector, that's usually a sign the rest of the financial world has already started paying very close attention, even if the general public hasn't caught up yet. There's also a consumer angle to this that's easy to miss if you're only looking at the industrial side. In China, humanoid robots aren't just showing up in factories and warehouses. They're becoming a genuine consumer product category. One company, UBTECH, recently launched a humanoid model it's calling the world's first full-size, mass-produced, ultra-bionic humanoid robot, priced at roughly $17,600 and reportedly already has more than 13,000 orders. Meanwhile, an entirely new rental market has sprung up organically, where individual entrepreneurs are buying humanoid robots and renting them out for events, demonstrations, and short-term commercial use, logging thousands of orders within months of launching. That's the kind of grassroots commercial momentum you can't manufacture with a government subsidy alone. It has to come from actual market demand, and in China right now, that demand is clearly there. Now, to be fair, it's not all smooth sailing, and a good analysis has to include this part too. There was actually a pretty embarrassing moment during the expo when part of a structure at the venue partially collapsed, and it's become a bit of a meme online. A reminder that for all the polish of the keynote stages, there's still some rough execution happening behind the scenes. Big ambitions don't always come with flawless logistics, and if you dig a little deeper, there's a more serious reality check too. A lot of the humanoid robots you see in flashy demo videos are still pretty limited once you get them out of a controlled stage environment. There are facilities across China right now where dozens of humanoid robots are essentially being puppeted through repetitive tasks by human handlers with remote controls, all in the name of collecting the physical world training data these robots desperately need to eventually operate on their own. Sorting packages, folding laundry, scooping popcorn, all done under human guidance rather than true autonomy. So there's a real gap between the polished demo reel and where the actual technology sits today. But even accounting for that gap, the trajectory is genuinely hard to argue with. China isn't just building AI software anymore. It's trying to own the entire physical layer of the AI revolution, the actuators, the manufacturing base, the training data pipelines, all of it, at a speed and scale that no other country is currently close to matching. So where does that leave the US in all of this? Because it's worth being fair here, America hasn't been sitting completely still. Lawmakers in Washington have been holding hearings specifically about the pace of China's tech progress, with witnesses at a recent congressional roundtable warning that China represents an existential level challenge and that the US needs to accelerate its own technological advances or risk falling well behind. Export controls remain the primary tool of choice, and there's an ongoing internal debate in Washington over how much further to tighten restrictions on advanced chips and manufacturing equipment headed to China. But here's the uncomfortable comparison. America's response so far has largely been defensive, restriction-based, and domestically focused. China's response has been offensive, alliance-based, and globally focused. One side is mostly trying to slow the other one down, the other side is trying to build something new and get the rest of the world to opt in voluntarily. Those are fundamentally different strategies, and historically, denial-based strategies tend to buy time rather than win races outright, especially against a competitor with the industrial capacity to root around the restrictions, which is exactly what we just watched Huawei do on stage with the Atlas 950. So let's zoom out, because I think this is where the America should be terrified argument really lands. For the last few years, the dominant narrative in the West has been that America is comfortably winning the AI race because it has better chips, better frontier models, and better funded labs. And on some of those fronts, that's still true today. OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google are still producing the most capable models in the world. NVIDIA still makes the chips the entire global AI industry is built on top of. Nobody's disputing that. But WAIC 2026 shows you a different kind of competition happening in parallel, one that doesn't show up in a model benchmark leaderboard. This is a competition over infrastructure, institutions, and global relationships, and it's a competition where the rules of the game favor China's playbook. Model quality is a moving target that resets every few months. Alliances, factories, and installed robot fleets are much stickier. Once 29 countries are running their AI training programs through a China-headquartered organization, that relationship doesn't just reset the next time a better model ships. Once a country's logistics and manufacturing sectors are running on Chinese humanoid robots, switching suppliers becomes a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar decision, not a quick pivot. That's the strategic pattern America should genuinely be worried about. China isn't trying to out-innovate Silicon Valley model for model in a straight-up sprint. It's playing an entirely different, longer race, building the physical and institutional scaffolding that the rest of the world will be standing on for the next decade, regardless of who has the top score on a benchmark this particular quarter. Here's a way to think about the stakes. In the space race, it didn't ultimately matter who launched the flashiest single mission if the other side built the infrastructure, the supply chains, and the institutional momentum that outlasted any one launch. What actually mattered in the long run was who built the rockets that kept flying, who trained the generation of engineers that kept innovating, and who built the alliances that kept paying off decades later. WAIC 2026 is starting to look like that kind of moment for AI. The kind you only really recognize in hindsight, except this time we get to watch it happen in real time, in high definition, with robots dancing in the background. China just launched an international governance body with 29 member states and 0 Western democracies among them. China just showed the world a chip-constrained supercomputer that still achieves serious scale through sheer engineering brute force, proving export controls alone can't fully contain them. And China is mass-producing humanoid robots at a pace that's genuinely without precedent anywhere else on the planet right now, backed by a consumer market, an industrial deployment plan, and a financial market all lining up behind it at the same time. Put those three pieces together, the alliance, the chip, and the robots, and you get a country that isn't just trying to win one race. It's trying to control three separate boards of the same game simultaneously: the diplomatic board, the compute board, and the physical manufacturing board. Most competitors in this space are still only playing one of those boards at a time. China showed up in Shanghai this July playing all three at once in front of the entire world's press corps. None of this means the US has already lost the AI race outright. It hasn't. American labs are still producing the most capable frontier models on Earth, and that lead is real. But if you're only measuring this competition by model benchmarks and chip specs, you're missing at least half the board, maybe more than half. The other half of this race is about who the rest of the world decides to actually build with, train with, and depend on. And this year in Shanghai, China made its pitch to more than half the planet, and 29 countries already said yes before Washington even had a formal counteroffer on the table. That's the story almost nobody in the West is really talking about yet, and that's exactly why this summit deserves the kind of attention usually reserved for a major geopolitical event, not just a tech expo recap buried on page 4 of the business section. Here's what to actually watch for over the next 12 months, because this story isn't finished, it's just getting started. Watch whether more countries quietly join WAICO beyond the original 29, because every additional member makes the organization harder to dismiss as a symbolic gesture and easier to see as the real institutional shift it's shaping up to be. Watch the IPO pipeline in Hong Kong and Shanghai, because if even a fraction of those 500+ robotics and tech companies successfully go public, you're going to see a wave of capital flowing into this sector that dwarfs anything we've seen so far. And watch whether Huawei's chip stacking approach keeps closing the performance gap with NVIDIA, because if brute force scaling keeps working, export controls become a much less effective tool with every passing quarter. If you want to understand where the US-China tech war is actually headed, don't just watch the chip export headlines every time they scroll across your feed. Watch what happens in Shanghai every July, because that's increasingly where the next chapter of this entire rivalry is actually being written. One alliance, one supercomputer, and one robot factory at a time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.